Everybody's time. We'll get started and then I can continue to let people in as they arrive. Okay, so with that, I have hit record. If anyone wants to, keep their camera off or anything, just be mindful of the fact that we are recording. All right, formally then, good evening and welcome to the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music's free virtual and very informal monthly series called Conversations with Our Curator. We've been at this over 2 years now, and it's so nice just to be here in conversation with some amazing authors and with just our friends from around the globe. As I said, really informal. I like it to just feel like we're hanging out right on campus, chat about great books together. If you don't know me, I'm Melissa, the Director of Curatorial Affairs for the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music and a history professor here at Monmouth University, just a mile from the beach in beautiful West Long Branch, New Jersey. Tonight, we have the pleasure of chatting about the book A Little More Love, The Life and Legacy of Olivia Newton-John by Matthew Hild, who is generously giving of his time this evening to join us. But before we dive into chatting with Matthew, a few housekeeping details. And as always, I apologize to our regulars who hear me say this month after month, but over 2 years in, we still always have new people each month. And I love that. And it is my job to spread the good word about all the work that we do at the center. So, first, if you are not super familiar with us, the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music is, as I said, located on the campus of Monmouth University, just a mile from the beach and just up the road from famed Asbury Park. Our mission is twofold. We preserve the legacy of Bruce Springsteen. We are his official repository, but we also celebrate the history of American music in all its diversity of artists and genres with our exhibits, our programming, our publications, and more. We are in the midst of getting ready to open a brand new 30,000 square foot facility, which is going to open on the campus of Monmouth University in just a couple weeks. I've been on the floor with the team installing exhibits since 7:30 this morning. I just saw my mom actually, and my mom was like, "Are you wearing that to the Zoom tonight?" I was like, "Mom, it's been a working day, okay? We're in our work gear because we are installing these exhibits and we cannot wait for you to see them." The building is, as I said, some 30,000 square feet. That includes a 241 seat Dolby Atmos certified theater, a gift shop, some 10,000 square feet of exhibits related to American music broadly and Bruce and the E Street Band, and of course, the archive for research. So you can see more about our new building, when it opens, how to get tickets, and about our exciting calendar of events on our social media and at springsteencenter.org. You can also donate on our website if you are so inclined, because we are, of course, a 501c3. I will put our link tree in the chat in just a moment so you can get connected with us if you are not already. Okay, so with that introduction there, let us dive into tonight's program specifically. We at the Springsteen Center have a lot of programming. There's programming on campus, there's programming off campus. For example, we've got a wonderful exhibit up in Passaic County right now, honoring the 50th anniversary of Born to Run. But then I also wanted us to have virtual programming for people who perhaps couldn't get to the great state of New Jersey. So Conversations with Our Curator is this free monthly web series where we feature researchers and writers exploring new perspectives in American music history. So after some initial questions from me, we will open the floor to audience Q&A. I really like to keep these events to no more than 1 hour, just to be, again, respectful of everybody's time. So, okay. Let me stop yapping and we will turn things over to the star of tonight's show, Matthew. Matthew, I'm going to warm you up with a softball question. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a historian, just like you, and a lot of my work has been academic about politics and race in the American South mostly. But during the pandemic, the libraries were closed, the archives were closed, and so kind of based on a suggestion of a friend of mine who had known the Bee Gees' younger brother, Andy Gibb, I wrote a biography of him, and that came out in 2022. And from that, that's really how the Olivia Newton-John project got started. Was a lot of people who I got to know writing the book and Andy Gibb had known Olivia too, and all liked her and said, "Why don't you write a book about Olivia?" And nobody's done that. And of course, I didn't want to write it too fast after her passing because it seemed a little bit tawdry or something. But on the other hand, didn't want to do it because a lot of people I interviewed, I mean, time marches on, right? And so a lot of people I interviewed are in their 70s or 80s, and I thought somebody should get their stories. I really tried to find people who were not necessarily the biggest celebrities because the celebrities have already kind of, it's on the public record. I was able to work that into the book, but there were dozens and dozens of people who worked with her and knew her well who never really had the chance to talk about her before, talk about their experience with her before. And so I thought, somebody should get that in the record while it's still possible.
I have to say, I love that so much. That's something I say about our own oral history program all the time. Like, yes, we have the opportunity to interview, say, Bruce and members of the E Street Band, but they've been interviewed over and over and over and over again, right? I want to find the people who are getting left out of the stories. One of our graduate students, Carly, did an amazing oral history interview with this woman, Marilyn Rocky. Marilyn was Bruce's landlordess while he was writing Born to Run. Like these lesser known characters. So I really, really identified with that and appreciated that about your work. So you told us a little bit about how you came to be looking at Olivia Newton-John as a subject for a full-length book. What are you most, well, let me back up from that a minute. For people who are perhaps not overly familiar with her outside of, let's say, Grease,
Right.
give us a thumbnail overview of her life and her body of work.
Well, in terms of her life, she really had three different home countries. She was born in England, but at a young age moved to Australia and then moved back to England to start a career and then moved to America around 1974, 75 when she really started to become an international star. So she really called three countries home with some legitimacy in all three cases, which that in and of itself was pretty rare. Not many people can say that. And I think at different times she identified more as a Californian American, other times more as an Australian, other times more English, depending on the setting. In terms of her career, there's that same kind of, you know, different phases of her career that almost are like different recording artists. Her early years, she was folk, kind of country tinged pop. Her first hit was a cover of the Bob Dylan song, If Not For You, which she really covered more the George Harrison version of the song, but that was 1971. And then around 73, 74, she starts doing this real like pale steel guitar tinged, country sort of half country, half pop. And she wins these major awards from the Nashville CMA, Country Music Association. And that creates a huge backlash because here's this, not only not a Southerner, but not even American, and beating out people like Loretta Lynn and Dolly Parton for these major CMA awards. And she really ran into a lot of backlash over that. And in fact, two of the people who really came to her defense were Dolly Parton and Stella Parton. Stella Parton wrote a song called Ode to Olivia, which really like apologized to Olivia for Nashville's like resentment towards her. And Dolly Parton meets her and takes her to dinner shortly after that, and they become lifelong friends. In fact, Olivia's last record was a duet with Dolly Parton, Jolene, a song that Dolly wrote and had a big hit with, and Olivia had covered and had a hit. And so the very last thing Olivia did was this duet with Dolly of Jolene shortly before she passed. Then in the mid 70s, her pop country career starts to go down a little bit. But then, as you mentioned, Grease comes along. She really reinvents herself as the leather clad, total, almost a total opposite of the girl next door image she had in the early mid 70s. All of a sudden, she's the black leather head to toe and sing "You're the One I Want" with John Travolta. And then the early 80s and the MTV era comes along in 81, and then she does the physical and the physical video, and she really becomes like I really think that Olivia and Jane Fonda were the two people who really like ushered in the whole 80s fitness craze. Jane Fonda with her workout in those days, VHS videotapes, and Olivia with the physical video and her kind of her spandex look. And so Olivia really had like three different major eras of stardom that were, I mean, she was always true to herself, but she was also a master, I think, at reinventing herself. And that's why she spent 15 years basically almost always, at or near the top of the charts, which is a pretty long run. I guess, in today's world, Taylor Swift would be the equivalent. And of course, Taylor Swift has reinvented herself too. So I think I'm not want to overstate the analogy, but in some ways you could draw a line between Olivia and Taylor Swift in terms of their versatility and their ability to always reinvent themselves. Because otherwise you don't stay at the top very long in the pop music business if you can't reinvent yourself with the times, right?
Yeah. Gosh, I always come into these with like an orderly list of questions. And then once we start chatting, I'm bouncing all over the place. I want to hone in on something you said about her being born in England, living in Australia, back to England, and then having such a tremendous career based here in the United States. This is something I don't want to say struggle with, but we debate a lot. It is our job to teach American music history, to teach American history through music. What makes an artist an American music icon? Right? I mean, do you have to be born in the United States? Is your success here in the United States? What are your thoughts on that, Matthew? And how do you think Olivia identified?
Well, you see, that's actually, I mean, you just kind of hit the nail on the head of the backlash she ran to in
Okay.
Nashville. At least part of it was, you know, basically almost, there was always kind of this unwritten rule, certainly 50 years ago and more recently than that, even I think that to do country music you had to be, you know, Southern and kind of, you go out on me there for a second?
I got it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
They had to be kind of, from a Southern, preferably poor, kind of rural background. And, Olivia was none of that. She was the daughter of an esteemed English and later Australian college literature professor who'd been a World War II Enigma code breaker. And on her mother's side of the family, her grandfather, Max Born, was a Nobel Prize winning physicist and a good friend and associate of Albert Einstein's. So, Olivia broke all those rules. And even that was one problem she ran into in Nashville. The other problem was, in a lot of ways, she was a pop artist, which again, she was like, you could say she kind of paved the way. Look at, Shania Twain, Faith Hill, 25 years later, right there, they were very much on that line between pop and country. But when Olivia was doing that in the early to mid 70s, she was, criticized for it and called a phony for it. So I think that right off the bat, just even not being from the South, let alone not being American, and she was also, until about, through that whole first heyday, she was recording at the Beatles' Abbey Road studio in London. So that was another. And I think it really wasn't until the late 70s that she really started to, and I don't think she even, she didn't really worry too much about, she'd say, I just make music I like where I want to make it, all this nonsense about pop versus country versus folk, just, I sing what I want to sing. But I think in the late 70s, when she started working, in Nashville and Los Angeles, then she started working with a lot more American musicians. I mean, a lot of her hits in the late 70s, early 80s, based like Toto was the band. It was, she was working a lot with American musicians and taking on more of an American influence in her sound. And I think you do hear, by the early mid 80s, in a way, kind of one of the things that she ran to that, finally helped end her heyday was she was competing with people like Madonna. And, in some ways, she did become kind of more of an American sign pop artist. There was nothing really, her early records, she kind of had the English accent going on, kind of an English take on country music. And by the by the 1980s, she really sounded as American as anybody else on American Top 40, I think.
Mm. I have this theory, Matthew, and tell me what you think. I think it's the general public who really prefers to categorize most artists. Like, we were actually doing a conversations with our curator with Kenny Chesney, and I asked him, do you
Mm.
think of yourself as a country artist or just an artist? And he's like, well, I think of myself as an artist, but because of my accent, people want to pigeonhole me in this way. What are your thoughts on whether or not we need to categorize artists, musicians in this way, or just let them make their art?
Well, it's interesting because ironically, when she was in her first heyday in the 1970s, sometimes I'll listen to on Sirius XM, Casey Kasem's American Top 40 from 1970s, and Top 40 was so diverse in those days that you could hear like an R&B song, a country song, a pop song, a rock song, all in like 1 hour of Casey Kasem's American Top 40 from a 1970s episode. Now, of course, the other thing I think is much more segmented. So I think there is more like pressure from record labels such as they are even nowadays, and publicity agents to really kind of pigeonhole recording artists because you know there's radio, even though and radio is not the force that was in Olivia's day. So I think recording artists now, they really do have to kind of be marketed as certain. I mean, there are exceptions, but I think most, and Kenny Chesney's not a newcomer either, of course. But I think for a lot of newcomers, everything's so segmented now with all these different channels of Sirius XM and people streaming and making their own Spotify list. They're not getting as widely exposed as they were in the 1970s. But to Olivia, she always thought it was really kind of silly. And, at times she even complained about, my record company. She was with MCA Records, which in those days was like her and Elton John, Leonard Skinner, but Neil Diamond. But Olivia would sometimes complain that like, my label's trying to make me record a more of a pop album. I want to do more country songs in this album. I want to have some folk songs in this album, and MCA won't let me. So I think that, that's kind of I think her career is a good illustration of the quagmire between a recording artists wanting hits, but also recording artists wanting to do what they really want to do. And later in her career, when the hits had stopped, and especially after she went through her first bout with breast cancer, beginning in 1992, she really did kind of, stop playing the game, so to speak. A lot of the songs that she wrote and recorded in the 1990s and into the 21st century, just the titles of those songs, Not Gonna Give Into It, Grace and Gratitude, Stronger Than Before. She really viewed her music more as a way of expressing herself and reaching out, trying to reach out to people who were suffering with some of the same things she suffered through, and trying to make her music more of a compassionate music that might actually touch people who needed some comfort and not worrying anymore about having yet another number one hit.
Yeah. Now, I'm still bouncing off of this first question that I asked you. You outlined three kind of distinct eras in her career. I'm fairly certain that my students, if they recognized her name at all, right, they would think of Grease. I think
Reese,
much of the general public would probably do
right?
that as well. And that's such a shame because here is an artist who, as you said, reinvented themselves over and over and over again. Do you think that she ever had any regrets about Greece or the way that it kind of consumed her identity, her legacy for many people?
No, I think, and this really gets in many ways to her attitude. And one of the themes of this whole book is that here's somebody who, she had this kind of Pollyanna girl next door image in the public's mind. And I think even Greece only kind of temporarily or slightly dented that. I think, she was always viewed as this kind of, the classic, girl next door who happened to be like, beautiful and talented, but still this very wholesome. And she was, but also she had a very strong, resilient personality. All these horrible things she went through in her life, that, on and off battles with cancer for basically the last 3 decades of her life, and horrible problems with, crazed fans trying to chase her down, stalkers, and a long-term boyfriend that went missing at sea and just disappears, and a pretty messy divorce. And she had an awful lot of hardships on her plate, and just had an unfailingly strong, positive attitude through all of it. And she was, again, one of the songs that later songs of her career that I mentioned, a song she co-wrote called Grace and Gratitude. I think that was her philosophy towards life. That's why her later songs, I think, are worth listening to, even though they're often overlooked, is that they really kind of, at that point, she was more concerned about expressing her own philosophy and views, and not worrying about American Top 40 anymore. But I think that basically she was so grateful for the career she had and the important things that enabled her to do, such as the Cancer Center in Australia and environmental causes and LGBTQ rights. Hoping his dog's barking out there. But at any rate, and so I think she was extremely grateful for her career. So her attitude towards Greece was she always embraced it. She thought it was the opportunity of a lifetime. And that's one of the last things she did publicly in 2019, right before COVID hit. She and John Travolta, some of the Grease like cast members and behind the scenes people, did 3 sing-along shows in Florida where the Grease is shown like a huge, outdoor drive-through kind of thing with the movie showing. And like every time a song comes on in Greece, like the words are put on the screen. Olivia and John Travolta are like leading the audience and singing the songs live while the movie's playing. And actually, she had hoped to do that in 2020 with she and John Travolta, but of course, COVID hit, and then by the time that was over, her health unfortunately. But no, I think she viewed Greece as a gift.
I think that says a lot about her character because I think there's a lot of celebrities who do come to resent that which gave them their celebrity, right? But she embraced it. That's interesting. Now, you just mentioned her somewhat complex, or maybe I shouldn't say complex. She just had a very human private life. What do you think, or how did you balance relaying her as a real flesh and blood human being and we have messy private lives? Like, where was the line between telling the biographical stories that you needed to but not being salacious or anything like that?
So this is actually one of the things that I really kind of grappled with Melissa because, she was a very private person. She did publish a memoir about 4 years before her passing, but the only reason she did that was because in Australia, a TV movie was being made starring Delta Goodrem, who actually was a friend of hers, but uh, a TV movie, two-part TV movie in Australia was being made. And Olivia found that about, of course, and she actually said, well, I decided if somebody else is going to tell my story, and they don't know my story as well as I do, so I'm going to write my own story. Although, as it turned out, you know, you can only say so much in one book, I guess, but she kind of had a selective, there's so many things she just kind of, forgot, chose not to talk, so I did still feel there was room to like write especially drawing upon people, like I said, people who knew her well and worked with her for years. But it was, I mean, I did kind of weigh that, I couldn't ignore important parts of her life, but I did try to like tread carefully on some things. I mean, for example, her first marriage, which turned out to be, I mean, and even there she was positive. Even after the marriage, failed and was kind of a messy end. She'd always say, "But if it weren't for that marriage, I wouldn't have had my beautiful daughter." And she tried for years to have children, and one was all she was able to have. And she had several miscarriages, and actually she was about to adopt a child when the child of two of her best friends, who was like the best friend of her own, Olivia's own daughter, that child died at the age of 5 of a horrible strain of cancer. And so Olivia decided at that point she wasn't going to adopt. She was just going to spend the rest of her life raising her child and trying to help children struggling with cancer and other health problems. But I think that the fact that she could point to that first marriage that ended so badly and say, but I wouldn't trade that marriage for anything because that's how I got my beautiful child. So that was kind of what I try to keep in mind when I was writing about private life was, don't try to make this sound like some. I mean, she did go through some rough stuff, no question about it. But again, she handled it with, a lot of grace and dignity. And I don't want to sound like I'm, but I think it's true. She really did handle some really rough things in a way that a lot of people could learn from. So that was kind of the guideline I tried to use was I don't need to get into every salacious, not that there was, I mean, there's really nothing salacious about her anyway. The salacious stuff was more what other people in her life were doing to her, unfortunately. But I tried to keep the big picture, like, what does this story tell about her, not what's it tell about all the crappy things other people might have done to her.
Yeah, I so appreciate that myself. As a historian and an author, we want to show figures from the past as like flesh and blood, human beings with all their challenges and obstacles and things like that. But at the same time, they're still human beings, right? And I think that we have a responsibility to show them some respect and dignity in telling their stories. So I really appreciated how you navigated that. You just mentioned, of course, the tragic story of, the family friend who dies of childhood cancer, and Olivia is going to become a major advocate for cancer awareness, really for wellness generally, right? You talked about her being up there with Jane Fonda on the early fitness wave. How important is her advocacy for cancer awareness, for health and wellness? How important is that to her overall legacy in your eyes?
She said herself, I've got the story somewhere in the book, but in 2012, the Olivia Newton-John Cancer Research and Wellness Center opened just outside of Melbourne, Australia. And she's being driven in the back of a car to the opening. She looks up and sees the big sign. And she says to somebody, actually, it was her personal assistant, but she says to him, that's going to be my legacy. That's going to be the most important thing I'm remembered for. And so that says a lot. That, I think for one thing, it shows how humble she was about her career because, a lot of stars would be like, I'll be remembered for my, the 100 million records I sold and my 4 Grammys, my 4 country music, country music association awards. So the fact that she was like grounded enough, in spite of this legendary career, she was grounded enough that, the big picture of her was what she could do to help people struggling with cancer, wildlife. There's a story I tell in the book about how I think it was 1976. She was about to do a tour of Japan where she was beloved. She was in Japan. She was like, even more popular than America maybe. And she canceled the tour because Japanese tuna fishermen had killed a dolphin as part of their, tuna fishing. And she canceled the tour in protest and said, "I'm not coming to Japan until the Japanese government puts in place regulations to protect dolphins." She got involved in an organization, helped found an organization about 10 years before she died called One Tree Per Child, that its goal was to go to schools throughout the world and help every child plant one tree somewhere before they, finish school. And that organization is now planting trees in something like 40 different countries, and the list is growing every day. So to her, I think all of that stuff was really, in the later years of her life, I think in her heyday, that side of her was always there. Of course, she hadn't had the cancer yet, but that side of doing things for causes that she believed in was there. But the demands of cranking out the number one hits kind of put that to the back seat. But after she got the cancer, and after her friend's child died, and some of these other hardships she had in her life, she switched the order. The career became less important, and her causes, cancer research and wellness, and the environment and children's rights and LGBTQ rights, all those things became more important to her than having any more hit records.
Mm. And that's just so very inspirational, right? It's like she wanted to leverage her success not to make her own life better, but to impact the lives of as many people as she possibly could.
Yeah, one of the stories that really struck me, when she was about 60 years old, she organized a charity walk of the Great Wall of China. And this was somebody not only age 60, but already been through some pretty rough health problems. And she gets sick doing it. While she's doing it, she gets sick and she still keeps walking every day. And that was one of the ways she helped raise this money to build the Cancer Hospital in Australia. Also, like going to like rich people's homes with her music director, and like he's playing piano, she's singing two or three songs that's, for $100,000 somebody's, birthday or something. I mean, she didn't have to do that. She could have been, again, she wasn't terribly well in some of those years. She could have been, just home with her family and, and not, but she really put herself out there in a way that, but I think that goes back to her attitude. Like you asked about Greece, like how she viewed Greece. I think she viewed Greece as a gift and her whole career as a gift. And one of the reasons why was because it gave her the power. She used several people interviewed said these exact words, that she used her power for good. Like the music was a springboard, but it gave her a platform. And she really, again, I sound like I'm, falling in love with my own subject, I guess, but I think it's pretty hard to find too many recording artists or performers who've used their power. Because Bruce Springsteen's a pretty good example too in terms of his activism and whatnot. But Olivia's case, politics wasn't her. It was just, but it was more humanitarianism, I would say. But she really did. She used her platform. She really devoted those last 25 years or so of her life to. I mean, she still had a balanced life, but she really viewed it almost as her responsibility to kind of pay back all the good fortune she felt she'd had, even though obviously she had some, bad fortune too. But again, her resilience and her social responsibility was, almost until her dying day, she's like, she's signing belongings and auctioning them, like signing albums from her collection, she auctioned off the Grease jacket to raise money for charity. So I think, it was important to her.
Mm. I'm going to ask a more academic question and then some kind of lightning round questions before
Okay.
we open it up to the audience. So, the more academic question, where do you place Olivia Newton-John within the larger story of popular music history? And do you think she's received the historical recognition that she deserves?
I think every era has it's kind of in any whether you're talking about like a male solo artist or female group, there's one or two towering figures. I think for women, it's probably in the like 50s, early 60s, it's Brenda Lee and Connie Francis and Patsy Cline, and then later on it's kind of groups like Diana Ross and Supremes. I think for Olivia's era, for the 70s, I really can't think of any other female. I'm Barbara Streisand in a way, but a much different audience. I think in terms of pop, Olivia was the same way Madonna was in the 80s or Whitney Houston a bit later on. That was Olivia's place. And for a very long time, I mean, again, how many artists really have like a 15-year
For this
career
program,
with a
Myron
constant
Metcalf,
with a constant
and then
record,
also Robin Wall Kimmer. author of the
I'm getting my mute button. Okay, there we
Okay.
go.
Okay. But anyway, so I think for that her heyday era, I think she was on top in the same way that Madonna, Whitney Houston is later on, or all the way down to Taylor Swift. And I think that, and another ton of thing about her influence was when she goes back on tour in late 90s, early 2000s, all these people show up. Mariah Carey shows up and sings "Hopelessly Devoted to You" with her. Faith Hill and Shania Twain show up, and they're like, ecstatic to meet her backstage. In terms of her place in history, actually, I think, it's sad, but I think it took her death in some ways to, I think she's sort of been taken for granted and certainly not forgotten. But, I think in the years leading up to her death, she wasn't really getting the same amount of, attention. She's kind of, more recent stars sort of pushed her back off and I think, it took her death to make people, kind of, wake up and realize that this was a major, I think if you look at the last half century, and I think you could say American pop music. I mean, like you said, I mean, actually, America was the biggest. I mean, she sold more records in America than anywhere. I mean, she had more consistent hits in America than she did even in Australia or England, or like her two home countries. So Americans certainly embraced her for a very long time, and I think that, in some ways that's the proof in the pudding, right? Somebody who's consistently, beloved and selling records for that long of a time. You can't. You can argue about their merits, of course, like anybody does, but I think the history books have to say she was, for the late 20th century, she was one of the giants.
Hmm. So here are some easier questions. Well, actually, maybe they're not easier questions. They're
We'll see.
designed to be, but you might wrestle with them. For
See.
folks who are not as familiar with Olivia's catalog, give us your favorite Olivia song. And everybody, I want you to jot down notes because this is your homework now to go explore these recommendations. So go, your favorite Olivia song.
Well, I mean, my favorite's probably the hits, like "I Honestly Love You" or later on "Magic" or "Physical." But the songs I would urge people to listen to are the ones that I mentioned before that people probably haven't, like "Grace and Gratitude," "Stronger Than Before." Not going to give into it because these are really the songs where she's, writing about her own, struggles with her health and whatnot, and she's, really trying to, for the first time in her whole career, express what she's really thinking, feeling, going through in music.
Okay. I didn't pin you down to one song there, but
Now,
you gave us some good
yeah, I
recommendations.
mean, if I had to pick one, "I Honestly Love You" is always her favorite. She redid it several times. I think that was her, that if there was one that was kind of like, but again, I'm sure different people would disagree with that too. When you have that many hits, it's hard for
Of,
anybody to agree.
of course. Do you have, if you could name her most underrated album, what would you say?
You know, it's interesting that you asked that because she was really seen more as a singles artist, I think. And, I think some of her early albums were kind of filler, but her physical album, that was at that point, she really starts to put more thought into, like, okay, the songs aren't the hit singles. So for example, on that album, she wrote a song called "The Promise," in parentheses, the Dolphin song. And that's really the kind of beginning of her, the shift towards her being more concerned about activism. So I think the physical album, people just remember the poster, and the song "Physical," but it really showed kind of the bridge to her later career.
Hmm, I love that. Okay, and the last of these quote easy lightning round questions, if you will. What's your favorite scene in Grease?
Mm, I'd have to say she always talked about Sandy number one, Sandy number two. That, Sandy number one was like the sweet, like Doris Day kind, and number two is when she comes out in leather. And I picked that scene, and you can see it on the actual camera. Plus, she always talked about this in interviews about how everybody just bugged out. Like even, the people on the set and working with her for months, like they couldn't believe it was her. She said, "Oh my God," everybody's like eyes popping out of their head. And I think if you look closely, you can really see it. Like John Travolta and these other people, they really are like freaking out at seeing her, come out in this sudden transformation. So I think that scene in some ways is emblematic of her whole career, kind of, the way she could change her identities and surprise people.
Awesome. Well, I could sit here asking Matthew questions about his book all night, but let's throw the floor open to the audience. You can unmute yourself or you can type a question or comment in the chat, and I would be happy to read it. So let us hear your Olivia Newton-John questions or comments, or maybe it's just a great memory. I see people talking about singing at the roller rink.
Xanadu.
John, I see you've unmuted. Is that by design?
Yes, if I could proceed with the question, I would be grateful.
You may.
First, let me apologize for being 30 minutes late. My workday ran late, so I do apologize. I pride myself on being punctual.
I'm not wearing my Professor Ziobro hat right now, so I'm not deducting points. Don't worry.
Good thing.
And forgive me, since I came in late, was there much talk of Xanadu?
No, and actually, that's interesting because that movie at the time was considered a flop. I mean,
Yeah,
the soundtrack had Olivia and Jeff Lynne at ELO, so and Cliff Richard. So the soundtrack was a huge success, but the movie was considered. I mean, like Siskel and Ebert trashed it. It won like the first like I think they called it the Golden Raspberry that was like invented partly for Xanadu. But the irony is now that movie's like become a cult favorite. In fact, Olivia lived to see this. Later in her life, she actually went to some festival in California
wow,
where there was all these Xanadu fans showing up, and of course, the one good thing she always said about that movie, even though later on she said, "Well, the movie was a misstep. I should have picked a better follow-up to Grease than Xanadu." But that's where she met Matt Lattanzi, who was her first husband, and as she would always later say, "True, the marriage didn't work out, but that was how that was how she had her daughter." So that was always the two good things she'd always say about Xanadu was, "If it weren't for Xanadu, I wouldn't have met my first husband, had my daughter, her only child." And also Gene Kelly. She got to sing and dance
right.
with Gene Kelly. She got to introduce her dad to Gene Kelly, which is a huge thrill for her. So again, her ability to always see the positive side of things. I mean, Xanadu in some ways was a big blow to her film career. Coming off of Grease, almost anything
Yeah.
should have been a hit, and Xanadu was a bomb. But again, now it has like cult status almost.
I just wanted to just make share an insight quickly. Is Jeff Lynne. I kind of grew up with my sister's ELO records, and I always kind of thought they were a little under the radar. I never saw Xanadu, but I had the record, and I know the title track Xanadu said about a million times. Now, fast forward, Jeff Lynne did the Traveling Wilburys. He did Full Moon Fever with Tom Petty. He did Analog Man with Joe Walsh. Jeff Lynne was always way ahead of his time. And in my opinion, that started with Xanadu because it took him beyond ELO. And I would argue that Olivia Newton-John inspired Jeff Lynne to go off and do what he did in some way. Obviously, I don't know. But it seems like Xanadu was the football that Jeff Lynne took and he brought it into the end zone.
Yeah, he actually kind of said that like maybe 20 years later in an interview. He said
Really?
he'd been really nervous going into that because Olivia was at least his level was a star at that time, and he had never produced anybody but himself in ELO. And he said that Olivia was so great to work with, and he had such a good experience with her that if it had gone the other way, he would have been scared off and never done it again. But because he had such a great experience with her and made different kind of records with her than he would have done with ELO, that kind of opened the door for that path.
That's awesome. That's really nice to hear.
We do have some Xanadu supporters in the chat.
Yes, yes, I saw.
I have a question from Nancy in the chat, Matthew, about Olivia's daughter.
Chloe.
Can you comment at all about where Olivia's daughter is now? Is she a singer? What's she doing, etc.?
She does sing. She records several duets with Olivia, going back as far as I'd say when Chloe was still a teenager. To one of the very last things Olivia did before the duet with Dolly Parton was a duet with Chloe. And Chloe's continued to make and release music. And Chloe's pretty active on social media, and oftentimes she does post something she's recorded or a clip of it. She'll say, "I promised my mother I would get this. My mother always wanted me to sing and get this out there." She hasn't recorded to nearly the degree that Olivia did, but in today's world, it's kind of hard. Record labels and stuff don't really exist the same way for most people the way they did 50, 40 years ago. But yeah, but Chloe's to some extent, Chloe's carrying on Olivia's footsteps or in her footsteps musically, and also Chloe's become a real champion of Olivia's charities. Every year there's still the Cancer Wellness Walk to raise money for the Olivia's Cancer Center in Melbourne, and Olivia did that as long as she could, and now Chloe every year is there. Every fall, Chloe's in Australia leading that walk.
How lovely. Was there anyone, Matthew, that you wanted to interview for the book and you just couldn't make it happen?
Yeah, there were several. Obviously, I would have loved to interview John Travolta, but I mean, he was pretty. It was he chooses when he speaks about Olivia, basically. Then there were other people. I tried to interview. I would have loved to interview Cliff Richard, who not such a huge star in America, but worldwide was a huge star. And, and he sang suddenly one of the hits from Xanadu with Olivia, and was a lifelong friend almost with Olivia. Sometimes she's like 17 to her death. And I reached his agent, and he said, "Well, Cliff's not doing interviews anymore." I thought, well, I wasn't sure if that is because he's 85 years old, or maybe he just didn't want to talk about Olivia. I know he issued like a tearful statement when she died. But I mean, some people. I asked them once, and if they said no, I just let it go. I mean, there's a fine. And like I said, it was more really. I was looking more for the people who had not been interviewed anyway. So, and most of those people I was able to get.
Mm. And I'm curious, this may be a bit of a wonky archivist question, so forgive me, everybody. But have you done anything with these interviews? Like, obviously, you use them in the book, but will they be archived anywhere and accessible to folks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for now, they're all living in, my Google Drive and emails. At some point, probably need to like, do something a little better with them. Just have them sitting there.
I don't know if you've heard of the Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music. We do
Oh
have
yeah,
an
I have.
active archive. We'll talk more about this later.
Yeah, yeah. No, I've seen your stuff out on LinkedIn.
Other other questions from the audience. You can unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can type a question in the chat. This is a question I'm always keen to ask any author. I actually did a virtual program earlier today for the Army Historical Foundation, and I asked that author, were there stories that you wanted to include, but you had to cut because of your word count?
I mean, not exact stories per se, but I would have gone into more details about her later years.
Mm.
Originally, I think the word count was supposed to be 100,000. And I kind of contacted Bloomsbury, the publisher, and said, well, and that's not going to quite cut. And they said, fine, 110, but not like one word of 110. So I think that's the economics of book publishing. I mean, 110 is not that long of a book, really. But so I couldn't go into quite as much detail about her later years as I might have. But I think I got the point across anyway that, basically the story of her later years was great, heroic, inspiring courage in spite of, a lot of pain, and, as her illness got worse. In a way, I'm not sure that would have been worth, going to more. I mean, the book already makes the point. She's, there's some pretty like firsthand stories from people like practically carrying her off stage. Maybe it's just as well that I didn't really belabor her
Mm,
suffering anyway.
yeah. Here's a question in the chat from Donna, who is one of our past conversations with a curator authors. Her book is Mary Climbs In, The Journey of Bruce Springsteen's Women Fans. And Donna asks, what was one thing that surprised you most or changed your view of her as you did your research?
I don't think I realized just like what a tough person she was. Again, obviously I just, saw Grease and, think things that are on YouTube and whatnot. But in her business dealings, she was a tough businesswoman. She was, tough in dealing with relationships when they broke. She was, tough facing her illnesses. I think that, you know, maybe that's part of the requisite for lasting success in show. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't know, but I mean, maybe that's one of the prerequisites really had in making it and lasting as long as she did. That no matter how nice and kind of a person you are, and by all accounts, she really was. By the same token, she was really strong and tough as nails and really resilient. And I don't think she would have even have lived as long as she did through all of the cancer battles she did, let alone accomplish as much as she did, both in show business and kind of for the greater good of cancer patients and wildlife and all these other causes. If she hadn't had this like underneath that sweet girl next door persona, which I think was in a lot of ways true, but she was also one really tough, hard-nosed person too.
Mhm. I love that, Matthew. That's like that saying, right? Don't mistake my kindness for weakness. Right?
Exactly. I
She
mean,
was
she's
a
like
kind person, but
living
not
proof of
weak.
that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think she was in some of her relationships, some of her failed relationships, she was by far the stronger person in the couple. And it
Mm,
was, basically she ended up being the one who walked away from, what she saw as a failing relationship.
mm. That is a really inspirational message. I think, as you talk about her to a younger generation. Here's a question in the chat. Of her hits, was she credited as a songwriter?
Not the big hits. Basically, it was more like B-sides and album tracks. And in some ways, one of the themes of the book is kind of the struggles that women faced in popular music in her heyday, where essentially MCA Records, and she had, kind of established songwriters writing for her. And, one of her good friends was Barry Gibb. He's, was giving her songs. And basically, the label didn't really want, they let her have album tracks and B-sides. Now later in her career, kind of her post-heyday, she was doing a lot of the writing. But like I said, those are the records that not as many people heard. But she was inducted into the Women's Songwriting Hall of Fame. So I think that, kind of speaks for itself. But she wasn't writing her hits, but a lot of these songs about causes she cared about, there's some really inspirational songs.
Mm,
That was her body of work as a songwriter, not the physical and magic and heart attack and all that.
mm. This is an interesting question in the chat. It says, I remember reading back in the day about the boutique she owned called Koala Blue that had a milk bar. Is
Yeah.
that true? And what happened
Australian Milk
to
Bar. Yeah,
the
well, see, it- this was kind of the era, I guess, when a lot of the American fast food places had like the milkshakes that weren't really shakes, those kind of frozen, like a Wendy's Frosty kind of thing.
store?
And so it was like and in some ways that wasn't the most Australian part of it, but it did have like a thing where they'd make the milkshakes the old-fashioned, the way they would have in a diner in New Jersey, 1950s, right? With the soda jerk and everything. But Quad Blue is mainly like Australian clothes and Australian candy bars, and the first one was on Melrose. Actually, Melrose Place in Hollywood before it really became, the hot place to be. But it became a chain of stores all over America eventually, and actually was doing very well. But I write about this in the book that it failed in the early '90s for a couple of reasons. One was that early '90s was like recession that kind of dovetailed with the first war in Iraq. But also, I mean, Olivia at that point wasn't really a business. I mean, she learned from that, became a much sharper businesswoman later on. So Paula Blue became kind of a short-lived, about a decade. But there are a lot of people. You can look on, Instagram, Facebook, and all these where there's like Olivia fan pages, and people still have their Paula Blue bags and Paula Blue sweaters. And it's kind of a big memorabilia market for that kind of Paula Blue stuff now.
Hmm, that's interesting. This is a comment and question in the chat. I discovered Olivia as a 12-year-old budding vocalist through her early hits, but I always appreciated her cover songs by other artists, some of which I enjoyed more than the originals. So, Matthew, what, if any, of her cover songs do you appreciate the most?
Well, the one that really got her career started in terms of the hits was, I think I mentioned, If Not For You, which was a Dylan song that George Harrison had covered and had a huge hit with. And Olivia made it her own. I mean, it became her breakthrough hit too. And think about if you've got, Bob Dylan and George Harrison are the two recording artists you have to follow, and yet you make the song your own, it becomes an international hit. That's pretty darn good, right?
Yeah, talk about holding your own.
Yeah.
Anyone want to unmute and ask a question, or you can continue dropping them in the chat here. Matthew, what were some of the repositories that were the most helpful to you as you did your research?
Well, the nice thing about this one was by this point, I was able to do almost all of the archival research online. There's this,
Mm.
and I put some of this in the back of the book, but there's this website called worldradiohistory.com, and it's got all the like billboards and cash boxes and like the British like Record Mirror and Music Week, like basically trade papers, small music industry trade papers from all over the world. How this is even like legal is kind of like it's all, at some point they must have worked it out because people know about it and it hasn't gotten taken down. But it's like all these issues of, Billboard going back to 1940. So for interviews, I mean, they weren't People Magazine or mainstream, but for they interviewed Olivia a lot and they reviewed her records. They interviewed her producers, and so that alone was a great. And then a lot of these newspaper collections too, just finding. In fact, when she performed at the University of Tennessee at Martin in 1974, and she's kind of doing her first American tour, I found the campus newspaper with like the review written by college students. So instead of just reading some New York Times review, it was like actual college student journalists getting their viewpoint of Olivia Newton-John concert.
Isn't it amazing? I say this to my students all the time. Like, you have no idea how lucky you are to live in an age where all of this archival material is digitized and you can find it online, right? I mean, what a game changer for researchers and authors.
Yeah, even when I was writing, that was probably why I wrote that Andy Gibb book. I was working on an academic book then, and I was having, at that point, there was things I needed where I had to go and put the gloves on, and,
Yeah.
and those places were closed for a year.
Yeah, and I think, the archival field has been working on digitization for both reasons of preservation and access, but a good thing I think that came out of the pandemic was an increase in the digitization, the speed and the need for it, and now we're all benefiting for it. Question from Debbie. I think there was a lullaby album. Is this correct?
Yeah, it was called Warm and Tender. And this was kind of the point in the late 80s where she kind of gracefully accepted the fact that her heyday, that she kind of ceded the stage to Madonna and Whitney Houston. And that was an album for her daughter. Her daughter was like 2 years old at that point. In fact, I tell a story in the book that around that same time, Olivia was offered the chance to tour with Frank Sinatra, and she turned it down because she said, I don't want to be on the road. She said, I hated to, she said, I hated to turn down a chance to tour. Imagine what it would have been like to sing a duet with Frank Sinatra on stage every night. But my daughter was, I was home like breastfeeding my daughter in those days, so I wasn't going to. But yeah, so it actually was like a special project kind of album. And it wasn't obviously a big hit, but it's all these like Disney songs and, really like gentle. And that's how she meant it, an album for like, calming babies at night, things like that.
Oh, it was authentic to where she was in her life at the time,
Right,
right?
right.
Here's a comment, but maybe you'd like to comment on the comment. Anne writes, I loved her as Bitsy May in Del Shore's Sordid Lives. She should have done more comedy. Thoughts?
Well, this kind of goes back to Xanadu. In some ways, again, Xanadu now is appreciated, but Xanadu sort of killed her acting career. And actually, there's one more movie after Xanadu. She and John Travolta reunited for a movie called Two of a Kind, and that bombed. The same, had a big soundtrack, and the movie bombed. And so basically, for about almost 15 years, she's not doing any acting. I mean, she did it, it was for friends of hers. She started a movie called It's My Party, directed by Randall Kleiser, who directed Grease, and it was about a true story about how a gay man discovers he has AIDS and kind of tries to die with it. That was like a personal project she wanted to do. Again, one of her many things for LGBTQ, like advocacy and rights. And so by the time she did Sword Lives, that was a friend of hers too. Del Shores was the producer. So they did the film and a TV series later on. But I think if Xanadu hadn't been a bomb when it was, and the second movie John Travolta hadn't been a bomb when it was, she could have kept, she would have done a lot more acting. But for years, she just kind of stepped off the stage because she felt like, and really, producers weren't calling her after, you have two straight bombs in any industry like that where it's all about money. And unfortunately, you know,
Yeah. We're almost out of time, but we've mentioned her advocacy and support of the LGBTQ community a few times. Can you tell us, Matthew, what inspired that, right? We understand where her support of cancer comes from. It was very personal to her. What about the LGBTQ community?
she had several very close friends who died of AIDS. And one story she often told was that one of these gentlemen had been her hairdresser during her heyday. And at the same time she was pregnant with her daughter, like in 1985, 86, the man was dying of AIDS. She wanted to go visit him, and the doctors told her, no, that's too dangerous. And of course, later on, people discovered, well, no, she could have visited him. She wouldn't have gotten, HIV or AIDS. And I don't want to put too much importance in that, but that was, I think, that wasn't the only reason. But she always expressed regret about that later on. Like, oh gosh, I should have gone. I love that man. I should have gone. He's one of my dearest friends in the world. I should have gone to visit him, not listen. So she had a lot of compassion, for all sorts of what she saw as people who weren't getting enough compassion from the rest of the world. And I think that was how, and she had her own personal ties to it too. She had, you know, two of the film directors she worked with were LGBTQ. So I think basically, again, it was, you know, what she saw in her own life that made her realize that, wait a minute, there's some injustice being done here and people need to come out and speak up.
Well, as I said, we are almost out of time, and I always want to make sure that I leave the ball in the author's court. So, Matthew, thank you for, again, sharing your evening with us. Is there anything we have not covered that you would like to?
Well, I guess my goal with the book, in some ways, the title, A Little More Love, was actually the title of one of her big hit songs, but the subtitle, The Life and Legacy of Olivia Newton-John, you know, some of the stuff we talked about, I think everybody knows. I mean, I've got stories about Grease and her hits and whatnot, but I think not enough people are aware of all these things she did, beyond that. So I hope that's, maybe the new thing that a lot of people learned about her was that, the career was just the scratching the surface of what she accomplished in life.
Well, I think that is a perfect place to end. Everybody, you are going to want to go out and get a copy of Matthew's book, A Little More Love, The Life and Legacy of Olivia Newton-John. Just out this year. And as we have seen, this is an artist whose legacy is so very much worth preserving and promoting and sharing with the next generation. So thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, lots of exciting stuff going on at the Springsteen Center. We will be opening for you in just a couple of weeks. Stay in touch via our website, which is springsteencenter.org, or find us on social media. Thank you so much, Matthew. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Have a wonderful evening.